Rise and shine. Well, any idea what time it is? Me neither, actually. See, I just finished a video about the German crime police statistics, and the whole way through recording it I had to think about a broader conceptual problem underneath all of that. And it's much easier to discuss this in the Anglosphere, actually, than it is in Germany. I assume it's similar in France. Part of the reason for that is a gigantic coordinated apparatus of genuine misinformation, designed to dampen or relativize the reception of these crimes whenever the statistics land. Another part of it is also the language barrier that insulates some of the European countries from each other's data. But the end destination looks suspiciously similar across all of them. Today, we go international because of that. As I argued in my last video on the Frankfurt School, the pathway for Europe and America might be different, but the destination seems to be converging. The very same problems, the same deflections and the same institutional reflexes across 5 countries and 2 continents, and the same questions hanging over every one of them. How did this happen? In this analysis we will start with the cases, and then we go on a frontal assault against the 11 arguments the Western intellectual class will deploy, in some combination whenever one of these cases breaks. We are the first wave, at least more garbage for us to clear. You'll blast anything that has more than 2 buts or ifs. You get me?
We get you, sir!
Throughout this video, we will rank order these arguments. An S-tier argument is convincing. It would be an argument that forces me to reconsider my views. A-tier is a reasonable disagreement in good faith. B-tier means that the argument generally tries to make its point but is self-refuting. C-tier is self-refuting and incoherent. D-tier is maliciously self-refuting, and the speaker knows exactly what he's doing. F-tier is the bottom of the list, structurally incoherent, asymmetrically applied, and self-aware enough that it can only be made in bad faith. Let's commence with the cases. We will examine 6 specific cases, 2 continents, 2 matched pairs, and 2 standalones. The first pair, the perpetrator the system had already caught. Charlotte, North Carolina, the 22nd of August 2025. Famously, Irina Tsurutska, 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee who fled the war, finishes her shift at a pizzeria and boards the Lynx Blue Line to ride home. She sits down, and the man behind her stands up, pulls out a folding knife from his hoodie and stabs her 3 times in the neck. She bleeds out on the train while the ethnically diverse backdrops watch her horrifically bleed out to death. Her killer is the Carlos Brown Jr., American-born, 14 prior arrests going back to 2007. He comes from a family that had been petitioning for years to have him involuntarily committed. 7 months before the killing, he had called 911 in a manic episode claiming that man-made materials inside his body were controlling his movements. He was released on a written promise to appear in court by a judge who might or might not have exhibited a slight in-group bias. Kinda strange how the Anglo-Saxon idea of being judged by your peers seems to take on a different character in a multi-ethnic society. April 2026, his public defender files a motion declaring him incapable to proceed. Schizophrenia. No state trial but indefinite psychiatric containment until a future panel deems him fit. A similar structure in Völkling unfolds, Germany. The 21st of August 2025, within the same week. Ahmet G., 18, Turkish-German dual citizen, robs a gas station with a butter knife for 600 euros. Police catch up to him, and in the ensuing struggle, he wrenches the service weapon from a rookie officer's holster and empties the entire 17-round magazine. 6 rounds hit the police chief, Simon Bohr, 34, husband and father of 2 daughters. Some of the final shots are delivered to Bohr's head, while he is already on the ground. The chief prosecutor calls this an execution. Fittingly, on April 1st, 2026, Judge Jennifer Klingenhofer at Saarbrücken District Court rules him to be incapable of bearing any guilt. Likewise, on the grounds of paranoid schizophrenia. The court rules Ahmet G. believed that the police were going to kill him, like in the USA. The defense had pleaded 6 years for manslaughter. The judge went below her own defense's plea. No murder conviction and instead indefinite forensic psychiatric commitment. Two continents, 1 week apart, identical legal mechanisms. In both cases, the state classified the perpetrator in a way that made the motive structurally unspeakable, medicalized him and removed him from the category of criminal altogether. See, neither of the two were able to understand their actions. That is exactly why the Carlos Brown Jr. mumbled to himself that he got that white girl. While Ahmed G. went out of his way to ensure the death of the police officer by shooting him in the head. Our second pair, the perpetrator that the system should never have let be. Houston, Texas, 17th of June 2024. Jocelyn Nun Garay, 12 years old, is raped and strangled under a bridge by 2 Venezuelan illegal entrants. Johan Jose Martinez, Rangel, and Franklin Pina both had been apprehended at the El Paso border weeks earlier and released into the United States on the Alternatives to Detention program, and thus with GPS monitors. The state knew exactly who they were, and the state had them in a managed release program. Likewise, it let them roam, and the death penalty is now being sought. It is the very same pattern that delivered Laken Riley to Jose Ibarra in Athens, Georgia, and Rachel Moran to Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez on a Maryland hiking trail, within the preceding 18 months. Illegal entrants with prior contract with the system released and then let loose on the average person. Our second case is rather famous. Southport, England, the 29th of July 2024. Axel Rudacabana, 17, walks into a Taylor Swift-themed dance class for little girls carrying a chef's knife ordered from Amazon. He kills 3 children, Bebe King, age 6, Elsie Dot Stancombe, and Alice de Silva Aguiar, age 9. 6-year-old Bebe King was stabbed 122 times. He wounds 8 others. He would have killed every child in that room if he could have physically reached them. Police later find ricin and Al-Qaeda training manuals in his room. Axel Rudacabana is Welsh-born, naturally a British citizen, second generation to Rwandan Tutsi Christian refugees. He had been referred to the Prevent Counter-Terrorism program 3 times between 2019 and 2021, and each referral was declined because no terrorist ideology had been identified. On the 23rd of January 2025, he gets a life sentence, 52-year minimum. The official British state position is that the killing has no known motive and is not classified as terrorism. After all, he's just a Welsh choir boy, am I right? Sant Pere de Rib in Barcelona on the 26th of March 2026. Noelia Castillo Ramos, 25, is killed by state-administered lethal injection at St. Camille Hospital. She's the youngest person ever euthanized under Spain's 2021 assisted dying law. The Spanish state just euthanized one of its most vulnerable citizens because it could not figure out how else to care for her after destroying every structure that she was once embedded in. And then they threw her into the multicultural wolf's den. Her case is rather similar to one in Berlin-Neukölln, Germany. Berlin-Neukölln, Germany, November 2025 through February 2026. A 16-year-old Turkish-Kurdish girl is raped in the garden of the Jugendclub Butzki-Allee, a youth center run by the Neukölln district government. The perpetrators film it and blackmail her to come back every Monday, or else the video goes to her parents. Naturally, she comes back. They also attempt to blackmail her into luring her 14-year-old sister in. The youth club staff knew about this. The Jugendamt, so Child Protective Services, knew about it, by their own admission since at least January 28th. Neither the youth club nor the Jugendamt filed a criminal complaint. A neighboring girls' center filed an affidavit, with the district council reporting that the relevant social services coordinator had said, in conversation, that the Muslim youth are already enough in the police sites. Internal communications confirmed by the Tagesspiegel used the phrase, "the young Arab background suspects would otherwise be stigmatized." The institutional intervention prior to exposure was to introduce safe words the girls could use to alert the staff members. The case only became public on the 23rd of February 2026 when the girl's father filed the criminal complaint himself. Investigations on the Jugendamt staff are at least now ongoing, but it is all quite reminiscent of the grooming gang scandals that shook Britain, isn't it? All of these are 6 scenes in different countries, different perpetrators, different mechanisms, but at the level of the institutional response, they are the same 6 cases. A girl, a woman, a child, an officer, ultimately a life is destroyed. The state had every opportunity to prevent it, and yet the state did not act. After the fact, the state classified the perpetrator in a way that minimized accountability, schizophrenia, no known motive, foster system failure. We didn't want to stigmatize anyone, and naturally the state pivoted to the discourse of resources, trauma, training, complexity, understanding. The destruction unleashed on the citizens enters the system, and the system absorbs it by increasing its own surface area. And naturally, like I've said in the beginning, there is a question that every one of these stories raises and refuses to answer. How is it that we got here? That is fundamentally what these 11 arguments are about. Every one of them is a load-bearing piece of the architecture that produces this very result. Argument 1. Studies prove that immigrants commit less crime than natives. Some variation of this is the first thing of the rag that gets wheeled out within 6 hours of any such case happening. The argument is true at one level of abstraction and false at every other level below it. See, the word immigrant is a bucket, not a category. Inside such a bucket, you have the Japanese engineer in Dortmund, the Korean dental student in Amsterdam, the Polish construction foreman in Birmingham.
I've just woke up in a fucking steaming mood, yeah? Because I live in a shithole! Do you know what I mean? Birmingham is a fucking shithole! I hate the fucking place! I fucking hate it! It's full of dickheads! I fucking hate it!
The Vietnamese chef in Marseille, the Estonian software architect in Stuttgart. You also, however, in the very same bucket, have the unvetted asylum claimant from Mogadishu, the Afghan youth who crossed the Aegean on a rubber boat, the Venezuelan who walked across the Darien Gap and presented himself at El Paso. All of these people are immigrants in the statistical sense for the people making that argument, depending on what fits the narrative. The academic of your choice will then pool them, average them, and subsequently announce that immigrants have lower or comparable crime rates to natives. But of course only if you want to set the scene that way. The Japanese community in Dortmund is one of the most successful lowest crime, most integrated cohorts in any German city. Their numbers are not just low, they are carrying the average. Pool them with the Afghan cohort and the average looks manageable. Disaggregate them, however, and the picture that emerges is one that every honest researcher knows. Some migration flows work beautifully, and some don't. And which is which depends on variables that the framework forbids us from naming. The entire rhetorical strategy of argument 1 depends on refusing to disaggregate. The moment you disaggregate the category of migrant, the conclusion becomes very simple. Migration is not a single phenomenon. Some kinds of migration are civilizational assets, others are civilizational crises. And the very question, which is the question that the framework cannot afford to have asked out aloud, because the answer would force a policy conversation about selection, about who to let in and who not to, and the selection is exactly what the framework treats as forbidden. Specificity will only ever be used to masquerade and never to distinguish. Let me kill a related myth while we're here, because it matters for the US context of this argument. Americans, more so than most Westerners, are told constantly that their country is a nation of immigrants, and that restricting immigration is un-American. This is historically false. The United States was, for most of its existence, one of the strictest filtering regimes on Earth. The Immigration Act of 1924 was an explicit national origins quota system that essentially halted Southern and Eastern European migration for 40 years and prioritized Northern and Western Europeans, overwhelmingly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The nation of immigrants rhetoric as we hear it today is a post-1965 artifact, and it describes a policy regime that is historically abnormal for the American Republic. When someone tries to tell you that America was built on immigration, then the honest response is that America was built on an extremely selective kind of immigration of white Western Protestants, famously only those of good character, and the builders considered the selection to be the entire point of the civilizational project. One outlier dataset to seal the point, because you really only need one. In Denmark, the Rockwool Foundation tracked the 1985 to 1987 birth cohort to age 30. The baseline conviction rate of native Danes is about 18%. Vietnamese Danish rates are comparable to native Danes. Pakistani descent are roughly double the conviction rate. Lebanese descent triple the rate at 60%. Likewise, Somali descent with 62% conviction rate before the age of 30 within this birth cohort. All of it is within the same welfare state, the same schools, the same labor market, the same pooled immigrant bucket, yet wildly different outcomes. The aggregate hides everything that matters, and the people who insist on the aggregate of Migrant know exactly what it is hiding. Every honest version of the immigrants commit less crime argument taken seriously ends at the same place. The composition of the migration flow determines everything, and therefore selection is the only responsible policy, which is exactly the position that the argument was deployed to refute. Thus, it is self-refuting. D tier. It sounds smart if you're retarded. It cannot survive disaggregation. The people deploying it are not unaware of this, they are doing it on purpose. Argument 2. Racial profiling, or structural racism, explains the discrepancy that we see in the crime stats. See, as a European, I really like this one. 13% of all the wizards are responsible for 53% of all the black magic. How could that be? Well, they get controlled and prosecuted more often naturally. This is an argument that sounds reasonable in the American context and ridiculous in the European one, for reasons that are worth unpacking, because once you see the asymmetry, you see that the whole framework is kinda stupid. Body cams have helped to disenchant this myth a bit, because it's harder to invoke structural reasons when shit like this is just publicly available now. A very rare Black Lives Matter W, I guess. But let's start in Europe. Europe is, for those of you watching from outside, enormously diverse internally. An Irishman, a Greek, a Pole, a Portuguese, and a Finn do not share a phenotype. A language, a cultural tradition, a religious history, or a political sensibility. Add to all of that the historical migration layers, so Turkish descent Germans, Vietnamese descent communities in Germany and Sweden, Korean adoptees across Scandinavia, Iranian exile communities in Berlin and Paris, etc. Europe is not a homogeneous bloc with a single dominant ethnic group. It is a patchwork of radically different populations living in proximity and has been for generations. This is naturally not to be mistaken for some stupid salad bowl or patchwork of multiculturalism framework, but rather as a uniquely distinct dense civilizational brotherhood. Frenchmen and Germans are widely different, yet neighbors, and naturally this led to constant warfare between everyone and everything. Romans even went to war with the ocean. And yet, even in its modern form, this patchwork has no crime explosion. French workers in Birmingham do not commit disproportionate violent crime. Well, unless they are that special type of French. Spanish-Italian communities do not show up in the assault statistics. Japanese Germans in Dortmund are, as noted, far below the German baseline, by an absurd level by the way. The internal European diversity does not produce violence on that level. When we produce violence, it has to be organized warfare. We have to keep our manners after all. What produces this very specific crime signal that everyone is talking about is a very specific cohort. Afghan, Syrian, Somali, Moroccan, Iraqi, Algerian, etc. It is the very same type that you would see in a Tyler Oliveira video throwing Eiffel Towers at you. Herein lies the thing that kills the profiling argument in Europe. This cohort is itself ethnically heterogeneous. An Afghan and a Moroccan do not look alike. A Somali and a Syrian do not look alike. A Pashtun from the Kandahar and a Berber from the Rif Mountains share essentially nothing phenotypically. They are as visually distinct as Finns from Sicilians, and yet all of them, across every one of these profoundly different ethnic groups, show the very same pattern in same categories of crime, in different host countries under similar legal systems. For the profiling argument to explain that, European cops would have to be simultaneously racist against Afghans and Moroccans and Somalis as well as Syrians, all at different intensities of course, while being not as racist against Iranians or Kosovo Albanians or Vietnamese. The profiling theory requires a cop who can distinguish a law-abiding Iranian from a crime-prone Afghan at a glance, which would require him to make a distinction that cannot be made visually at all. The theory asks us to believe that European police have developed an exquisitely precise form of racism that tracks cultural origin invisibly and then applies it consistently across 28 countries, as well as thousands of police forces. Now, as a very high-level ethno-guesser player myself, I can assure you the racial profiling retardation is what you propose when you need an explanation for the observed pattern, and the correct explanation is forbidden. Now, what does distinguish the problematic cohort from the unproblematic one is not the phenotype. It is a cultural and religious framework. The Afghan Pashtun worldview and the Moroccan Berber worldview share very little ethnically, but share a great deal about the position of women. the legitimacy of infidel law, the moral status of the outgroup, and the inherited attributes towards sexual availability of outgroup women. That is the variable that tracks the outcome, and it is the variable that the framework refuses to name. Now, the American version of this has a real and tragic history of racial friction that grows out of slavery and is its aftermath. Parallel societies formed there under conditions of forced involuntary migration. Obviously, the forced migration was itself a catastrophe for everybody involved. The places that bought the slaves would have been better off not doing so, not because the slaves were lesser people, but because heterogeneity imposed on a society produces conflict that compounds over centuries, because different people are different. That is a general principle about population composition, and it's one of the stronger arguments against mass migration of any kind, voluntary or otherwise. Heterogeneity creates friction. Friction then invites exclusion, and that produces exactly the racial tensions that American commentators now invoke as an unresolvable structural feature of their society. It was, however, never inevitable. It was imposed. Noteworthy, furthermore, is that the American runs into these intergenerational problems because they emancipated their slaves. See, Arab slave traders, for example, had systematically castrated male captives, and thus, following the broader end of that slave trade imposed by the British, these populations just vanished from that part of the world, more or less. The very reason these people can complain about slavery is their emancipation. Within the American context, structural racism as a causal factor for some of the crime patterns has real historical reference, through things like redlining, for example, that the European version just doesn't have. It is still insane cope, however. African Americans had the ability and pathway to assimilate fully, and many indeed have. Yet, at the very same time, some choose to celebrate their otherness and practice reverse eugenics that, combined with retarded policy, produced 53% of all black magic, despite only making up 13% of all the wizards. Crazy how that works, huh? Yet, there's a funny twist to the structural racism claim. Certain, more recent migration cohorts in America have attached themselves to the existing racial guilt infrastructure that was built around the descendants of slaves. The Somali community in Minnesota is the clearest example. Somalis have arrived in the US as pirates and refugees, starting in the 1990s. They have no historical connection to American slavery. They are not descendants of slaves. They do, however, share a loose phenotype with both the strange-looking airplane that NASA uses to transport satellites and descendants of slaves, and they have, quite deliberately, used that phenotypic similarity to plug themselves into the structural racism discourse as if they were indistinguishable from black Americans for purposes of grievance entitlement. They are in essence cultural guilt-free riders. Listen and leer, my fellow minorities. Their entire claim on American racial sympathy is a claim by proxy, routed through a phenotypic resemblance to a population whose historical situation they do not share. This also happens in Europe, but in reverse, where you have minority communities making grievance claims directed at countries that had nothing to do with it. Why the fuck would a Swede have to pay for colonialism? Why would a German have anything to say about slave trade or Black Lives Matter? Yet, it's here anyway. Naturally, the crime patterns in the Somali Minnesotan community do not match the structural racism explanation. They much rather fit the Algerian and Moroccan patterns. Said patterns are downstream of inherited cultural frameworks, not American slavery. But this very framework lets them borrow the moral immunity of a different population's history to avoid the conversation about their own, which is quite funny considering that the descendants and the profiteers of the Islamic slave trade are now trying to invoke victimhood through another people's enslavement. And thus this argument is a well-deserved D-tier argument. In Europe, the argument is absurd on arrival. The heterogeneity of the problematic cohort falsifies the profiling mechanisms on contact. In America, it might have real historical reference and might deserve a more honest conversation instead of the hyper-bloated guilt narrative it is now. This is why that topic is being captured by populations whose situations do not fit it, using phenotypic proximity as a smuggling route. They are not the only ones. Just take a moment to appreciate this gem. Angela Davis, Omega race grifter of the highest order, finds out that her ancestors were among the first colonizers and owned slaves themselves.
Any idea what you're looking at? That is a list of the passengers on the Mayflower. No, I can't believe this. No.
Oh, yeah.
My ancestors did not come here on the Mayflower.
Your ancestors came on the Mayflower.
No.
You are descended from one of the 101 people who sailed on the Mayflower.
Oof. Yeah, that hurts, huh?
That's a little bit too much to deal with right now.
Did you ever, in your wildest dreams, think that you may have descended from people who laid
Never.
the foundation
Never.
for this country?
Never.
Now can you work out for me how much structural racism is helping you and how much of it is holding you back, lady? Or is it maybe just a malicious grift to scam a civilizational project? We might never know. Argument 3. The crime rates are due to poverty and socioeconomic factors and not necessarily inherent group differences. This is the grand dame of structural deflections, the dogmatic ur-form. Crime isn't about culture, religion, group, family structure, or inherited worldview, let alone biological differences. It's about material conditions. Fixing the material conditions will fix the crime naturally. Now, it's true that poverty correlates with crime. The question is, however, how much of the variance poverty actually explains. Once you control for everything else, the answer is some, but not enough. The gap between groups shrinks under controls but never vanishes. There is always a residual, and this residual is where the entire fight lives. The rhetorical move that hides the residual is the expansion of socioeconomic status into a Rorschach blot. By the time SES, which is short for socioeconomic status, has absorbed income, education, neighborhood, family structure, father presence, school quality, peer group, drug exposure, language competence, and time in country, the construct already explains everything and thus predicts nothing. The cleanest falsification is here, once again, a comparison group. Vietnamese refugees arrived in Germany in the 70s and 80s with nothing. Barracks housing, no language, no networks, active discrimination in both East and West Germany. They fit every textbook definition of deprivation. Their crime profile is below the German average. Not only that, but their rates to enter higher education by now is higher than the German average. They do better, had worse conditions, and are less criminal while being visibly foreign, with a traumatic war story to boot. In comparison with the current refugees, we have the same poverty conditions, worse opportunity structures, yet much better outcomes. If material conditions were doing the work, then this should be impossible. The harder falsification of this argument runs in the opposite direction, in fact. Some European countries have spent staggering sums on integration infrastructure for recent immigration cohorts. Language courses, housing support, cash benefits, vocational training, counselors, mental health services. Per capita, these are the most generously supported migrant cohorts in human history. And the second-generation crime rates for certain origin groups in those countries are worse than the first generation, even after controlling for age and socioeconomic status. We spend more resource for worse outcomes. If the material variable were primary, then this should be impossible. But it isn't. The variable that varies is not material. Where this argument has real teeth, however, is on property crime. Hungry men steal bread. Sure. Plausible and documented. Where it collapses catastrophically is on the violent crime and sexual crime categories respectively. Gang rape is not a response to material deprivation. The body of a stranger is not bread that you can steal. That kind of crime is an expression of a worldview about hierarchy, availability, and impunity, and that worldview is transmitted by culture and heritage, and not property. Yet, the socioeconomic status is actually a C-tier argument. The honest partial version has a real point on property crime, but we are not discussing this today. The dogmatic universalist version is self-refuting the moment that you introduce a comparison group as we have. Argument 4. Integration just takes time. Give them a generation. 2. The grandchildren will be fine. We have been here before. The Italians in the 1900s, America, Irish in the 19th century, Britain, Turks in the 70s in Germany. They all had elevated crime rates at first and are now converging. more or less at least. The historical parallel has real substance. Some migration flows do converge over generations. The Italian-American and Irish-American convergence is real. Turkish-German convergence has been slower, but measurable over 4 generations. Likewise, Polish migration to the UK integrated quickly and unproblematically for the most part, despite a lot of problems in the beginning. The pattern is not really universal, however. Convergence is observed in some cohorts, and divergence, including worsening in the second generation, is observed in others. The variable that predicts which way a cohort goes is not the income, not legal status, and not the time in a country, not state support level. It is cultural distance between source and host, and thus linked with heritage and nationality, which are the variables that the structural framework forbids us from naming. The cleanest demonstration is Denmark, again, because the Rockwool cohort data tracks the second generation directly. Vietnamese descent Danes converge to the host baseline. Pakistani descent Danes are roughly double it. Somali and Lebanese second generation cohorts are 3 times the host baseline. Same country, same generation, same welfare state, and profoundly different outcomes. The convergence model cannot account for this, because the convergence model assumes that all source populations converge under equivalent conditions, and yet they don't. The specific cases in the opener make this impossible to dodge. 3 of the 6 perpetrators were second generation or later. Ahmet G is a German-born Turkish-German. Axel Ruder Cabana is Welsh-born to Rwandan refugee parents. De Carlos Brown Jr. is American-born, fully integrated in the technical sense by every measurable standard that the framework can use. The integration takes time argument predicts that these people would converge to host norms by definition, and yet they clearly don't. Hence, D-tier, half true in a way, yet designed to soothe. The cases that disprove it are getting more and more frequent, not less, and they now include the second generation as the dominant pattern in several countries. Argument 5. The disparity is mainly due to most of the cohort being young men. Demographics explain these problems. Young men between 18 and 30 commit the majority of violent crime in every society on Earth, one of the most stable findings in criminology, the age crime curve, observable across cultures, centuries, and legal systems. Migration cohorts are disproportionately young and male, therefore crime data reflects demographic composition. This is actually the most honest argument on the list. It has actual explanatory power. Demographics matter. If you took every Afghan man between 18 and 30 in Germany and replaced them with an Afghan man between 50 and 70, the crime rates would drop dramatically, even if you replaced them with women. The deeper problem, however, is that the variable explains a portion of the gap and not all of it. When you control for age and sex, as anybody serious should do, the gap shrinks but never disappears. Just with the socioeconomic factor, there's always a residual. The 81% second generation non-Western access in the Danish data survives both controls for age and socioeconomic status. The German studies find the same. The Dutch CBS finds the same. The residual is where culture lives, and the demographic argument cannot really absorb it. If demographics were the full explanation, then foreign women should pattern like most host women, and yet they don't. In fact, the German 2024 criminal data shows that female non-German nationals in Germany have a violent crime suspect rate higher than the rate of German men of comparable ages. Syrian and Afghan women specifically show elevated rates that no demographic model predicts. Whatever variable is doing the work, it operates on women as well. But even if I'm willing to completely grant this argument, then the demographics argument, at its strongest, is an argument for not importing the demographic profile in question, isn't it? If you accept that young, unattached, socially uprooted men from failed states are the highest risk demographic in any society, and you accept that recent migration flows have disproportionately consisted of exactly this demographic, then by the argument's own logic, the migration flows have predictably and avoidably increased the risk-bearing demographic in the host country. The argument is not a defense of the policy in question, it is an indictment of it, dressed up as a defense. People who deploy it have accidentally agreed with a position they think that they are refuting. They just refuse to follow the argument to its conclusion. This is a pattern for the rest of the list. Every single argument we tier today, and granted its premises, becomes an argument against the position that it was deployed to defend. Every single one, without exception. That is of course not coincidental, it is rather the structural signature of a framework built to be recited and not reasoned. Yet this argument is still B tier. It is the only B tier on the entire list. Real explanatory content hides within it. but it also walks itself into the policy implication that its proponents refuse to accept. Argument 6. Historical trauma and post-colonial context. Migrant populations have been through wars, civil wars, refugee camps. The trauma is real and is carried forward. This does play in a way into the post-colonial flavor. There is a historical debt that the West owes for centuries of extraction from the source regions of these populations. And in the most perverse form, this argument proclaims that the violence that we see now is the chickens coming home to roost. Let's take the strong version of it seriously, because the trauma is real and the historical record is likewise real as well. But the predictive role of the trauma frame collapses the moment that you introduce a comparison group once again. Vietnamese refugees fled one of the most brutal wars in the 20th century. Napalm, chemical weapons, total devastation, re-education camps, and boat journeys with 30% mortality rates. Their post-arrival crime profile in every Western host country is below the host baseline. Likewise, Bosnian Muslims, for example, survived systemic rape camps of the Bosnian War. Their diaspora communities in Germany and Austria are statistically unremarkable, at least by comparison. German men returning from prisoner of war camps in 1947 had every conceivable form of war trauma, plus combat experience and total societal collapse behind them. Yet, post-war German crime did not show a multi-decade wave of sexual violence. They showed the opposite. Trauma exists. It affects individuals, but trauma does not produce the specific patterns of group sexual violence and out-group targeting that define the cases we discussed. If it did, every post-trauma population would show the same similar patterns, and they obviously don't. The variable that predicts the pattern is not trauma, but instead what this population's inherited cultural frameworks say about the permissibility of violence against out-group members. The trauma frame is being asked to carry a load that it cannot carry, because the correct load-bearing variable is forbidden. The post-colonial extension of this argument quietly assumes a kind of intergenerational collective guilt that the same thinkers would categorically reject in any other context. If a German child born in 2010 inherits no specific guilt for the actions of the German state in 1942, which is virtually the only responsible position, then a French child born in 2010 cannot inherit a specific guilt for the actions of the French state in Algeria. And that is ignoring the fact that the French had ended one of the worst slave empires in the world by colonizing Algeria, but whatever. Either inherited collective guilt is a coherent moral category, in which case it has to apply universally and symmetrically, or it isn't, in which case it can't be deployed selectively against the West only. The argument is empirically wrong about the populations it claims to represent. The largest source of populations of recent irregular migration to Western Europe are not really from regions with meaningful European colonial histories. Syria was an Ottoman province until 1918. Afghanistan was the graveyard of European colonial ambitions. Somalia had only a brief colonial presence and is not a former colony of Germany, Sweden, or the Netherlands, which are the countries currently absorbing the largest Somali descent populations. The post-colonial frame cannot even point to the right historical victim. It is an emotional gesture in the shape of a historical claim. And of course, the darkest version of the argument, the one that gets rarely said out aloud, is that the West deserves what is happening to it. In a dark twist, this is actually not entirely wrong, because now that we know it is happening, we should do our best to stop it. Yet the people that say this propose that the violence is cosmic correction, that the dead women and children are paying a debt that their grandparents owed. This is of course a moral atrocity dressed as historical retribution. It treats the named woman from the intro as acceptable collateral in a historical settlement that was never put to them. Irina Zurutska did not colonize anything. Bebe King was 6 years old, and Noela Castillo should never have been ravaged by the system. There is no world in which this could ever be deserved. Thus, well-deserved F tier. An argument that uses historical atrocities deployed as predictive models that it cannot support, while carrying a darker and disgusting implication that its defenders mostly refuse to defend in public. Argument 7. John Lennon's Imagine. We're all human, universal equality, and so on. This is the foundational metaphysical claim behind everything else on the list. Stripped of all the jargon, humans are everywhere, and always the same. Cultural variation is cosmetic, all observed group differences in behavior are circumstantial at best, and any analysis premised on group difference is both empirically wrong and morally bankrupt. Now there is a version of this claim that we can accept as true, and a version that is definitely false. And naturally, the framework conflates both of them on purpose. The version that is true by our civilizational consensus is that every individual human is morally equivalent in dignity, rights more or less, and intrinsic worth. That is something that we have decided upon. No human life matters less in cosmic accounting. No race is lesser in any meaningful moral sense. Two infants of any ancestry are equally precious and equally innocent, as well as equally entitled to the protection of their parents. This is the moral universalism of Christian and Enlightenment tradition. For the sake of what we are discussing, it's not in dispute. The version that is clearly false, however, is the further claim, smuggled in alongside the moral claim. It is that behavioral patterns at group level are more or less uniform under identical conditions. It is that every population given the same opportunity structure would produce the same outcomes naturally. The cultural or biological transmission produces no measurable differences in outcomes at scale. That family structure, religious doctrine, in-group out-group definitions, and inherited norms about violence and sexual access have no predictive power on their own, let alone biological markers like neoteny, cousin marriage, IQ, delayed gratification, frustration tolerances, and other temperamental differences. The second claim is empirically false, of course, and the falsification is overdetermined. Every dataset that you can find falsifies it. Every comparison of inherent group differences will falsify it. The Vietnamese versus Afghan contrast falsifies it. The first versus second generation divergence falsifies it. The female cohort data falsifies it. Adoption study data falsifies it. It is not even a close call. The framework merges the true moral claim with a false empirical claim and uses the moral force of the first claim to immunize the second from criticism. And thus, denying that all populations behave identically under identical conditions gets coded as denying that all human beings are morally equal. These are completely different claims. The first is an empirical statement about culture and behavior, and the second is a moral statement about dignity. Conflating the two is the central rhetorical operation of the blank-slateism that we are refuting here. You can hold the moral universalism and reject the empirical universalism, because the empirical claim is wrong. Every dignity-affirming person should reject the empirical universalism, because it is exactly what gets the women and children in the opening list killed. A framework that refuses to see culture and biological differences cannot protect the people whose lives depend on that being seen. Thus, D-tier. The argument conflates a true moral premise with a false empirical premise to immunize the false one. It is self-aware enough to know that the conflation is happening. It is built to make accurate description of the world feel like moral failure. Argument 8. The vast majority are peaceful. Stop generalizing migrants. This is the #NotAll defense. See, most Muslims are peaceful, most refugees are law-abiding, most second-generation Moroccan men in the Netherlands have never committed a crime, pointing at the violent minorities generalizing, which is unfair, and bigotry. Now see, statistically, if you remove all the crying, the claim is actually true. Rhetorically, however, it's vacuous. And the vacuum is the entire point of this argument. Of course, most members of any large population are not criminal. Well, except for the French, because it's wrong to be French. But, even if we ignore this, if even 5% of any given population would be actively violent in the streets, then any city would be uninhabitable. Public policy is not made by asking what percentage of any given group is peaceful. It is instead made by asking what the rate of harm is relative to the alternative compositions of the population. So, how much does it increase if I add a bunch of Somalis, for example? The Danish numbers that I gave you earlier, so 62% lifetime conviction rate by the age of 30 among male descendants of Somali immigrants. That is 62%. That's not just a few bad apples, that is worse than a coin flip. Imagine someone proposed a social arrangement that would produce a 62% lifetime conviction rate in any cohort of your fellow citizens. Would but 30% of those people are still good citizens be sufficient justification? Obviously it wouldn't. The framing of the #NotAll only works if you're not allowed to compare it to the alternative. What if we just don't have any Somali migrants? Herein lies a structural dishonesty, because by saying most are peaceful, the speaker is implicitly admitting that there is a threshold, a point at which it would no longer be acceptable, as it wouldn't be okay if it was everyone. right? They want the comfort of most without ever being asked most as opposed to what. What if it's just a third? What if it's 50%? Once you make them name their threshold, the conversation changes. They are now negotiating where the line of acceptable rate is and not whether there is one or not. Thus, every honest version of this discussion is a negotiation about thresholds. The dishonest version pretends that thresholds don't exist. Also, it misses the underlying problem, as it is about the rate increase relative to the host population and not the absolute rate. Just imagine the before-mentioned statistics of the Somalis in Denmark. The Danish conviction baseline in that age range is 18%, so roughly 1 in 5. Imagine you're playing Russian roulette and you now introduce the chances of the Somali rates. With 60%, they are about 3 times higher than the native Danes. And thus, for the sake of this comparison, in relative terms, you can add 2 more bullets to the chamber. Now, our revolver has a 50% chance to send us straight to our maker. Is this increase warranted? Is it acceptable? When would it be okay? Would you put this revolver to your child's head? And calm yourselves with the fact that not all chambers are fully loaded. Naturally, no one would ever do it, yet collectively we have done exactly that. Still, D tier. It is statistically correct. It's not everyone, but argumentatively empty, built to stop the conversation by making the questioner feel like a bigot for asking the necessary follow-up. Argument 9. We have a humanitarian obligation. The data is secondary. This is a moral bypass, even if every empirical claim in this very video is correct. We have a moral duty to refugees. The duty is categorical. It is not a subject to cost-benefit analysis. The Geneva Convention, international law, the post-1945 consensus, basic decency. Empirical trade-offs do not apply here. Now let me steelman this in the only honest form that it has, which is the deontological version. A categorical moral duty that refuses to engage with consequences is a coherent philosophical position. The religious pacifist holds it, the Kantian holds it. There is a serious philosophical tradition for the claim that some duties must be honored, regardless of outcome. I disagree with that obviously, but it's an honestly held intellectual stance. What it cannot do, and where the actual deployment falls apart, is pretend to be empirical at the same time. The blank slate version tries to have both of it. The data that you're citing is misleading, and we have a moral duty regardless, and you're a bad person for asking either question. These are all 3 arguments in a trench coat. You have to pick one. Either the data is different from what the skeptics say, or the data doesn't matter, and thus you don't get the rhetorical benefits of both at once. Yet there is a more fundamental problem. The obligation that this argument invokes is one-directional. It runs between the host society and the immigrant, but it does not run between the host society and its own citizens, who appear to have a weaker claim on the state's protection than people who have not yet arrived. Every functioning state in human history has prioritized its own citizens over non-citizens, not because non-citizens are less human, but because the state exists as a trustee of a specific people. That is literally the founding premise of any nation-state in Europe. Its primary duty is fiduciary. It runs for the people who constitute it. A state that places the interests of unfiltered non-citizens systematically above the safety of its own has not become more moral. It has abdicated its founding purpose. All it has become is a hotel lobby with a flag. Every victim named here was a citizen or legal resident of the country in which they were killed. Every single one of them had, by the founding logic of their state, a primary claim on that state's protection. And in every case, the state failed, because it had reorganized its priorities around a different beneficiary class. The humanitarian frame operationally is not a moral upgrade on citizen protection, it is instead its substitution. Thus, well-deserved F tier. Although maybe respectable in its purely deontological form, it is never deployed in this form. Kindness to the cruel is cruelty to the innocent. Argument 10. You sound like a Nazi, or far-right narratives are the real danger. Now, in the crude form, whatever you have just said, however carefully worded, however well-sourced, sounds like something that a Nazi might have said in 1933, and therefore must be categorically rejected regardless of whether or not it is true. Naturally, this is not an argument, but a ritual curse, and its purpose is to mark the speaker as outside the tribe. Observation X is true, the Nazis also held Observation X, therefore Observation X cannot be said. Under this rule, nobody could point out that water is wet, because Nazis believed the water was wet. Likewise, some of the first animal protection laws were introduced by the Nazis. Is the counter-move now to torture your animals? Well, unless you're Hassan Piker, this position is obviously stupid.
Christ, what are you doing? You're being such a baby.
The structure is so absurd that it cannot survive being applied to itself, which is the diagnostic marker of a bottom-tier argument. The more sophisticated version of this has colonized elite Western discourse over the last decade, however, and is thus much more dangerous, because it sounds reasonable to people who would never use the word Nazi themselves. It goes something like this. The real danger is not the incidents themselves, but the far-right narrative about these incidents. The actual harm is not the rapes or the killings or the cover-ups. These are bad, obviously, but the real actual harm is the political response, the radicalization of voters, the rise of populist parties, the empowerment of the AfD or Restore Britain or Vox in Spain. Therefore, talking about the incidents helps the far right, which means talking about the incidents itself is a form of harm. Therefore, the responsible thing to do is not to talk too much about them. We see this reasoning in Guardian op-eds, you see it in the EU reports on disinformation, and you see it in the academic papers about the weaponization of migrant crime statistics. It is the ruling class form of the Nazi reductio. This argument is actually claiming that the political consequences of accurate observation is more harmful than the events being observed, which means it has, implicitly, run a moral comparison and concluded that the rise of right-wing political parties is a worse outcome than the continuation of the underlying violence. It is willing to sacrifice people like Irina Zorotska, Bibi King the 6-year-old, as well as the Turkish-Kurdish teenager in the Vutski Allee, as long as no one draws politically inconvenient conclusions from their cases. Now, an idiot might think this is actually a moral claim, but what it really is quite Machiavellian. See, the political elite in Europe does not want to be replaced by the alternative, and thus they invoke this narrative. But the argument is structurally guaranteed to produce the very thing that it claims to fear. If you forbid mainstream discussion of an obvious and worsening problem, then you don't eliminate the problem, believe it or not. You instead eliminate the moderate venues for discussing it. The discussion then in turn migrates to less moderate venues. Voters who notice something is wrong, and they do notice, find that the only people willing to say what they see are the people that the establishment has already labeled as extremists, and thus they vote for the so-called extremists. The reductio doesn't prevent radicalization, it manufactures it. One last observation on this point. The same framework that uses "you sound like a Nazi" to suppress discussion of some patterns in violent crime is completely silent on patterns in violent crime when the profile is convenient. The Christchurch Shooters Manifesto gets quoted at length in academic papers about the international far right like it's their new Bible. Meanwhile, Axel Rudakabana's bedroom, in which Ricin, the Al-Qaeda training manual, as well as an obsession with genocides is clearly able to be made out, as well as 3 prior referrals to the Prevent Anti-Extremist Network. All of this naturally produces an official government determination. There seems to be no known motive, and thus of course is not classified as terrorism. The asymmetry is the confession. The framework has rules for when the patterns can be named and when they cannot. Thus, deserved F tier. The crude version is structurally incoherent. The sophisticated version is morally monstrous in its implicit weighting. Both are self-aware. Now, we have all these 11 arguments that attempt to explain away the consequences of multi-ethnic societies, yet none of them earned an A or an S tier. We have one B tier argument, which is the demographics one, but it self-destructs on its own terms, and the rest is much below that. The pattern is unambiguous. Every argument on this list, taken to its own conclusion, undermines the position that it was deployed to defend. Every single one, not by accident but by design. This is what arguments built to be recited rather than reasoned look like. We return back to the cases that I opened with, because the question that we opened with, so how did we get here, has an answer now. And this answer only becomes visible once we have the 11 arguments laid out in front of us. So, how did we get here? We got here because the West, over roughly the last 6 decades, talked itself into a very specific intellectual position about itself and about the rest of the world. The position has many names. In the academic circles that it lives in, it's labeled as critical theory, post-colonialism, third worldism, the various studies departments. In activism it lives as anti-racism, decolonization discourse, the inversion of the universalist heritage into the mirror image. In policy circles it lives as the migration consensus, the integration paradigm, the multicultural settlement. Within legal practice it lives as the expansion of the asylum doctrine into a de facto universal right of arrival, in human rights and the universalist approach to it. In the media it lives as the editorial standard that Western failures get sustained interrogation, while non-Western failures get contextualization or silence. These look like different things from the inside, but from the outside they are the same thing. And that thing has a single operational core. The West is the unique source of historical evil. Non-Western populations are the unique recipients of historical injury. The moral debt runs in one direction only. And naturally, the duty of the West is permanent self-correction, in deference to the people it has wronged. Once you accept this very premise, and most of the institutional class of Western civilization has accepted it, often without ever being asked to examine it, every one of the 11 arguments we tiered today follow automatically. Of course, immigrants commit less crime. The alternative would slander the morally victimized. Of course, the gap is structural. The alternative would attribute fault to the wronged, which is forbidden. Of course, trauma explains it. The West owes them, and the trauma is the receipt. Of course, you sound like a Nazi for asking. The moral asymmetry requires that doubt be coded as the worst available sin. These 11 arguments are not 11 independent intellectual positions, they are 11 faces of the same position. This premise produces operationally a very specific psychological and political effect on the host population. It produces paralysis. It produces a Western citizen who cannot defend his own community without first seeking permission from a moral authority that will never grant it. Thus it produces a Western judge who cannot convict a perpetrator of a culturally legible motive without first reaching for a clinical workaround that lets the motive go unnamed. It produces a Western social worker who watches a 16-year-old be raped twice in the building that she is paid to keep safe and deliberately decides not to call the police. It produces a Western state that kills its own gang rape victims by lethal injection and calls it dignity, because the framework cannot imagine a form of care that would actually require the state to do its job. It produces a British counter-extremism program that looks at a teenager with ricin, Al-Qaeda manuals, and 3 prior referrals, and an obsession with genocides, and rules no known motive, we just don't know, while putting you on an extremist watch list for nativist or, God forbid, nationalist positions. This doesn't happen because the analysts are stupid, but because the category of Islamic anti-colonial hatred that would have made people like Axel Ruder-Cabana legible is forbidden. The result of all of this is paralysis, self-censorship, institutional incapacity. The Western state forgets how to do the most basic things a state exists to do, which is to distinguish those it protects from those that it does not. In biological terms, the immune system of the body is told that the antigen detection function is itself a form of bigotry. The body stops detecting antigens. The infection spreads. Yes, this ideology is literally AIDS for the Western world, incidentally also applied by the most fake and gay among us. But there is a second side to the effect, and it is the side that the framework's defenders almost never want to discuss, because acknowledging it would require admitting what the framework actually does. The framework does not only paralyze the host, it also signals to the most hostile individuals within imported subcultures that their hostility is not merely tolerated, but historically vindicated. It tells them that the West is what their inherited grievances always said it was. A guilty nation with no right to defend itself. It tells them that the host's population's women are fair targets in a long historical settlement. It signals to them that the host institutions will not act against them, because the host institutions themselves have agreed in advance that action against them would be racism, and by doing so it hands them a permission slip written in the language of the host's own moral self-flagellation. Take a listen to Shabir Ahmed, the ringleader of the Rochdale grooming gang, sentenced in 2012. So quite a while ago, yet we can see the pattern clearly. He was sentenced for the systemic rape and trafficking of underage white girls in northern England. From the court record directly, his own words to the British court that was trying him are as follows. That's it, guys. How dare we create bioengineered honeypots for these noble people? His entire courtroom strategy was that the prosecution itself was a racist conspiracy against Muslims, an argument that he carried all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. He was using the framework against the framework's own people. He had absorbed the host civilization's self-criticism, repackaged it as proof of his persecution, and weaponized it to attempt to escape accountability for the rape of children. He's not unusual. Across the Rotherham, Telford, Rochdale, Oxford, Huddersfield, Halifax, Newcastle, Bristol, Aylesbury and Banbury cases, we have the same recurring court testimonies. They all show perpetrators telling victims things like, and likewise we have victims' descriptions. Pakistani men pass you around like a ball. They're all in a massive circle and put a white girl in the middle. They were not improvising this, they were operating inside a worldview that had preloaded the victim category. They had explicit theological and ethnic frameworks for why the host population's daughters were available. At the same time, the host's institutions, who had adopted a framework that forbade them from naming what was happening, let all of it happen for over a decade across more than 50 British towns. The J report in 2014 on Rotherham alone estimated 1,400 girls abused over 15 years. The report's most damning finding was not about the perpetrators, however, it was about the response. Council staff described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of perpetrators for the fear of being called racist, and some remembered clear direction from their managers not to do so. Police in Telford described parts of the town as no-go areas, and the inquiry found nervousness about race bordering on a reluctance to investigate. Channel 4 commissioned a documentary about grooming gangs in Bradford in 2004. The Rotherham abuse was at peak intensity, and yet the broadcast was postponed over fears of inflaming community tensions. The 2025 Casey review finally acknowledged what every honest observer had been saying for 2 decades. Disproportionate involvement of Pakistani heritage men, flagged as Asian by the way, which is kinda crazy to think about, but sure. In Operation Stovewood Rotherham specifically, we have roughly 2/3 of 323 suspects of Pakistani ethnic background. That is a town in which Pakistanis are 3% of the entire population. The response to all of this was a cover-up, not negligence, but the deliberate institutional choice, repeated in council meetings, police briefings, editorial offices, all the way up to the Home Office, because the framework had taught everyone involved that the alternative was unspeakable. Now take a look at Wutzke Ali in Germany, Berlin. 4 months of abuse ending in February 2026. A youth club run by the district government. A 16-year-old girl raped, filmed, blackmailed into returning every Monday. This is the very same case as Rotherham. Different country, different decade, different perpetrator nationalities even. Identical institutional responses. In both cases, the framework instructed state employees that protecting the victim would require identifying the perpetrators in a way that the framework forbade. So they didn't protect the victim, they introduced safe words, they postponed documentaries, and they wrote internal memos about community sensitivities. They watched the abuse continue, and they wrote reports about how the real problem was the far right. Now look at the other end of the effect, at Völklingen. Look at Charlotte. 2 continents and the identical legal mechanism. The perpetrator is medicalized and removed from the category of criminal. A Turkish German executes a police officer on the ground after emptying a magazine into him, and is ruled unaccountable by a judge who goes below her own defense's plea, on the grounds that the killer thought the police were going to kill him, like in the USA, which is completely deranged by the way, because the German police is pretty much the most trained and well-educated police on the planet. We shot 22 people in 2024 in a country of 80 million. America, a country 4 times the population, has shot 1,100 170 people in 2024, which is 53 times more. Yet, the fucking judge ate this shit up like it's candy. An American native-born man with 14 prior arrests stabs a Ukrainian refugee 3 times in the neck on the public train and is declared incapable to proceed by his public defender, the same court that had been releasing him on his own recognizance for years. The same judge is obviously exhibiting an insane in-group bias. The entire case reeks of racial hatred, from the Carlos Brown Jr.'s to no one in the train helping here because they felt no inherent kinship with Irina as she bled to death. It is the very same mechanism. The perpetrator becomes a patient, the case becomes a failure of the mental health system, and the call goes out for more resources, more clinics, more training, more competency evaluations, more alternatives to detention. The next case likely already happened many times over, we just didn't hear about it. This is what the framework actually does that we are discussing today. It's not a passive intellectual position, it's an active operational program that produces very specific institutional behaviors in response to very specific kinds of acts. When an accurate description of a perpetrator would falsify the framework's central premise, then the framework deploys the 11 arguments that we have tiered prior to make accurate description impossible. When that fails, the framework medicalizes, and when the medicalization would be too obvious, then the framework simply refuses to file a complaint at all. And when the bodies pile too high to ignore, the framework then accuses the people pointing at the consequences of being the real problem. This is the documented institutional record of every Western country that has adopted this framework. The structuralism circle jerk. It is what produced the Wutzke-Allee response, it is what produced Rotherham and all the cover-ups. It is what produced the Saarbrücken verdict, it is what produced the no null motive ruling on Southport. It is what produced 601 days of legal battle in Spain to establish the right of the state to lethally inject Noelia Castillo Ramos and harvest her organs. It was what produced an alternatives detention program that released Jocelyn's Nungary's killers into Houston with GPS monitors attached. Every case is a direct, predictable, institutionally traceable output of this very framework. The framework's defenders will tell you that the cases are isolated incidents, that focusing on them is misleading, that the real story is the rise of the far right. The framework has a script for everything. The script always concludes that the framework should be expanded, and never that it should be examined. Inside all of this, there is a false dichotomy that does most of the work, and I want to name it before I let you go. Either you accept all the framework's assumptions, the universalist and empirical claims, asymmetric in its moral allocations, deferential to the asylum seeker over the citizen, paralyzed by historical guilt, or you are a racist, a hate-monger, a far-right radical, a person who wants to put people in camps. Of course, this dichotomy is false. There is a third option, and it's the most normal default of every functioning civilization in human history, including most of the West for most of its own existence. We have just put it in a box because we are traumatized. The third option is that you are allowed to have a culture, you are allowed to set conditions of entry into this culture, you are allowed to defend its foundational premises, and you are allowed to exclude people who refuse those premises, not because the excluded are subhuman, but because your own culture is worth preserving, and not every worldview is compatible with every other worldview. When I travel to Saudi Arabia, my wife is expected to cover up. So am I. I am a guest. None of this is oppression. It's an invitation into a foreign house on the rules of the host. If I refuse these rules, I leave. Every functioning society on Earth has operated the very same way for the entire history of our species. We didn't invent this principle, but we temporarily forgot it. Discrimination, in the older and honest sense of the word, the fact of distinguishing, is not inherently evil. It is in fact a precondition for any form of meaningful coexistence. A society that refuses to distinguish between its members and its guests, between its values and its alternatives, between the conditions it accepts and the conditions that it does not, has already given up the project of being a society at all. It has become a hotel lobby. Just take a look at the founding documents of your country, whichever Western country you're watching from, and look at the first words. We the people, dem deutschen Volke, inscribed across the front of the Reichstag. La République Française in every founding text, in every constitution, in every cornerstone, there is a who, a specific people, a defined community, a we that is not we the human race, and not we the global community of suffering. It is a specific we, with specific rights, specific obligations, and a specific state that exists to serve them. The state's first obligation is, and always has to be, to the we, not to the people outside of it, not to the people who would replace it, but instead to the people who are it. Irina Zarutska had become part of that we when she took legal residence in North Carolina and worked a job. Officer Simon Bohr was part of it by birth and conviction. Bibi King and Elsie Stankombe, as well as Alice de Silva Aguiar, were 6 and 7 and 9, and they were part of it, dancing together inside the implicit value structure manufactured by the British people. Noelia Castillo Ramos was part of it, Spanish-born, raised in the Spanish state's own care system, and then betrayed by it. The 16-year-old in Vutskeli was part of it. Every single one of them had a primary claim to the protection of the state they lived in, and every single one of them had this claim betrayed by an institutional class that reorganized its priorities around a different beneficiary. This framework has to die, not because people pointing at it are crypto-fascists with a hidden agenda, but instead because the framework is now actively killing the people that it was built to protect, and refusing to die is its only remaining function. Just imagine a predator, the aliens from the very same film universe. One of them shows up in a crowded subway in Brooklyn. He rips a guy's spine out of his ass and exits at the next station, carrying this spine as a hunting trophy home. The internal logic of the framework that we have just spent an hour dismantling would demand the following response. The state would convene a panel of structural sociologists. The panel then would identify the systemic failures that led to this incident. The mental health resources culturally appropriate for the Yautja's background would be made available. The behavior would not be characterized as criminal necessarily, because we can't exactly impose Earth's juridical norms on a sapient species with its own deeply rooted hunting and trophy-taking traditions. Then the New York Times would publish an op-ed warning against the dangerous rise in anti-Yautja prejudice. A British broadcaster would run a panel on whether the spine removal had any known motives, or whether, on balance, it was best to leave the question open. The European Commission would then form a working group on hunter-gatherer integration. The Berlin district of Neukölln would introduce safe words for subway passengers that can scream out as their spine is ripped out of their ass. See, it sounds like I'm joking with you, but I'm barely exaggerating. We have already done all of this with humans. We are doing it right now. The only reason the predator hypothetical sounds so absurd is that the perpetrator looks alien enough to make the absurdity visible. When the perpetrator looks like a guy from your neighborhood, or well, a guy from your modern neighborhood, I suppose, or like a young man at a youth club, or like a paranoid drifter on a train, well, then the absurdity becomes invisible, because the framework that we live in has trained us not to see it. Once you abstract the situation to the right level, however, you do realize that it has been completely deranged ever since its inception, and that this very derangement is institutionally protected, and that the protection is really what is killing the people mentioned. If you have arguments, objections, things that I've missed, drop them in the comments. The S and A tier slots are still empty. Maybe you can make it into the next tier list. Thank you for your time.